In many ways, the formation of the New Testament is less complicated than the Old Testament, but maybe just as messy. Since the New Testament was written in a period of time where writing materials were far more common and where there was a shared culture and language across the whole Mediterranean world and even extending even further than that, and that the early church took great care to protect some of these sacred writings because of persecutions in the first and second century. We have a greater body of early evidence of these writings than we do with the Old Testament. In many cases, we have just a few decades and sometimes maybe a century between the original texts and the earliest copies we have. Unlike the Old Testament, where it's lots of times many centuries and sometimes over 1,000 years. The very earliest days of the Christian movement didn't have a lot written down. In those first couple of decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, the church relied heavily on the teaching and the witness of the original apostles. These apostles would go around and spread the word of the good news of Jesus, the gospel, and they would found churches, along with a slew of other disciples who were also there and witnessed the 3-year ministry of Jesus and the resurrection. These disciples would go and use the Jewish texts of the law and the prophets to show how Jesus had fulfilled what was promised in them. Because of this, many of the texts in the New Testament are letters. In fact, most scholars agree that the letters were written first, and the very earliest letter seems to have pretty universal agreement was Paul's letter to the church in Galatia. Most of Paul's letters were written between 49 AD and 65 AD, when he was most active in his missionary work. There's other letters that were attributed to others in the early church that were probably written during this period, but there's more likely that they were written in the later first century, and there was even some who have been purported to have been written by one of the early witnesses, but was probably written after their deaths in the early second century. These letters it's important for us to understand them, are not written as theological treatises. These letters aren't there for us to examine in some kind of theological way. Do they give us a good example and a good idea of what the theological beliefs of the early church were? Yes. But we have to remember the context of these letters were not that the authors were writing words of God, but that they were living in relationship with the early churches that were forming all over the Mediterranean world in the Roman Empire. And they were answering specific questions, or they were addressing specific issues or problems within those churches. And so these letters were written in relationship of the author with the original recipients. And so we need to read them this way. We need to read them as relational documents addressing practical concerns of the early church. And it might be one of the reasons why these letters so quickly became passed around all the other churches, as they were useful and pragmatic for the life of early Christians. The Gospels were all written in the later half of the first century. First probably came Mark, and then Matthew, and then Luke a little after that. John was written at the very tail end of the first century. So why did these early Christian leaders wait so long to write down their memories of what Jesus taught and what Jesus did in his 3-year ministry? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's just that the early church didn't need those texts. They had the eyewitnesses there and teaching, and there was some suspicion that Jesus might return earlier than what has actually occurred. And so they didn't think to write them down until they began to lose some of those early witnesses. And then that's when a few of them decided that they needed to write down and record what was being taught by these early apostles so that they could be handed down from generation to generation. Ironically, one of the earliest evidences in manuscript form we have for a book of the New Testament is actually from the Gospel of John, the latest written book. And yet that text is a fragment of papyrus that most scholars believe is from sometime in the 2nd century. There's a lot of splits among where this exactly dates in the 2nd century. Some scholars push it to the early decades of the 2nd century. Other scholars argue that it belongs much later in the 2nd century. But regardless of who's correct in that debate, this kind of early evidence of an ancient text is fairly unheard of among lots of different kinds of ancient texts. And so to have something connected this close to the source material is pretty unique. And it's nothing like what we have for the Old Testament. And we have much more than just this papyrus with a small fragment of the Gospel of John on it. We have a whole swath of manuscripts that date from the 2nd or even the early 3rd century, which gives us pretty good evidence of when the different letters within the New Testament and the different texts within the New Testament were written. It helps us to understand how these texts were passed down, but we also have a tremendous amount of evidence from early Christian leaders from the late 1st century writing letters just like the original apostles did to the churches. And in that, they would recognize various texts that were passed around and even quote from them. These different early attestations help us to know that these texts dated from sometime before the end of the 1st century. And this knowledge really helps us to see the formation of the 27 books within the New Testament. In fact, the only one book that wasn't mentioned in these early mentions of the texts of the New Testament is 2 Peter. All the rest of the 27 were mentioned by some leader in the late 1st century or early 2nd century. All of the New Testament texts were written in Greek, specifically Koine Greek or marketplace Greek, which was a common kind of tongue of the Mediterranean world in those days. Some scholars think that there maybe was a Hebrew or probably more likely an Aramaic version of the Gospel of Matthew long before it was ever recorded into Greek by someone else later. But that's a different story. For now, these 27 books, it's important to understand, weren't the only important Christian documents in the 1st century. There were many others. Letters like the Shepherd of Hermas or the letters of Clement and documents like the Didache and many others had pretty early attestations of being connected to an apostle. They were pretty widespread in the use of the church. And then they also were fairly orthodox in what they taught comparative to what the earliest Christian leaders and the apostles had taught throughout the churches. So why did these books not make it into the New Testament? How did we end up with the 27 that we had today? By the end of the 2nd century, many different schools of beliefs around Christianity began to crop up. Some of those beliefs began to teach things that were direct contradiction to the earliest teachings of the apostles. One such leader's name was Marcion. Marcion believed that the God of Israel was a false god, a demigod, a lower god that had stolen the authority of the real God, the true God, when he created the entire earth. That the demigod of Israel created the entire earth, not the real God. And that the God of Jesus, the Father of Jesus, is the true God, and Jesus came to show us the way to the true God. Of course, this completely contradicts what the earliest apostles, who were mostly all Jews, believed and taught. But Marcion began to take some of the writings of the early Christian church and collect them together. And he began to edit them to fit his views. And then he espoused the texts that he had edited as the only authoritative texts for the Christian faith. Marcion had created what was seen as the earliest Christian canon. And yet the early Christian leaders around his time totally rejected it, seeing his beliefs as completely contradictory to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they began to write in refutation of his beliefs. Leaders like Tertullian or Tatian or even Irenaeus. These different leaders wrote in much argumentative nature to say that Marcion's teaching was false. And by doing so, they began to list for themselves which texts what they saw were most authoritative for teaching us about the doctrine of Jesus Christ and that what we should believe as Christians. A lot of the 27 texts that we have in our New Testament today were included in those lists in refutation of Marcion. with the exception of just a few. Letters like 2nd Peter and 2nd and 3rd John, James, Jude, and sometimes even Hebrews and Revelation were missing from these early lists. Sometimes they would list these other books as being good books, but they wouldn't list them as scripture that early in the 2nd century. Even before all of this, we have some authors who mentioned the 4 Gospels that we have in our New Testament today as being the authoritative Gospels. Why? Why would they say these things? Well, because in the 2nd century, a slew of other texts that had the word gospel attached to them and some apostle's name were written. And many of these other texts taught things that were drastically different than what the earliest church was teaching from the apostles' leadership. And so they were rejected and said not to be gospels in any true sense at all. And instead, authors would list the 4 that we have as being the most authoritative. And so the early church struggled about which texts to include and which texts weren't, and what beliefs were truly Christian and what beliefs weren't. And as the church grew and became accepted in the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th century, it became really important for them to begin to nail down what was Orthodox belief and which texts were authoritative. So by the end of the 4th century, a council had met of bishops from all over the Christian world, and they debated which text should be included in. And at the end of that council, they came up with an authoritative list of these are the books we believe to be inspired by God and good for the regulation of Christian life and Orthodox teaching and belief. And these books were the 27 books that we have today. Now, there hasn't been universal acceptance of these 27 books throughout all time. In fact, if we get to the Protestant reformers a little bit more later, we might talk about how they looked at some of these books and how they called to question some of the books that even the earliest church fathers also called to question about whether or not they should be truly taken at the level of God's word like others were. In general, there were some criteria that the early church fathers used to determine which books would be included in the New Testament and which would be left out. This kind of rule was considered and called the New Testament canon. Canon not meaning the device that would shoot projectiles over a long distance, but instead canon meaning a rule or a test that something needs to pass. These criteria included things like a direct line to the teaching of an apostle, a general acceptance among the churches of history and of the current day, and widespread use among those churches. And also that the doctrine within those texts didn't contradict what the general consensus of the Christian church at the time believed to be the earliest Orthodox teaching of the Christian faith. All of these things went into consideration when they put the list of 27 books that we have together. And by the end of the 4th century, it was ratified, and everybody knew that this was the book that we had, and it hasn't changed since. Of course, in a video like this, just like the Old Testament, it's impossible for us to go through all the details of the formation of the New Testament, but I hope that you've received enough information that you can go and do some research on your own. In fact, I might suggest to you buying the book Making Sense of the Bible by Adam Hamilton. I relied heavily on his chapter on the formation of the New Testament in here, and it's very good and it's very approachable, and it contains much more information than I've included today. And so pick it up and read the entire thing. It's really good. But as we look at the New Testament, we have to understand how it was formed if we're going to read it with the right viewpoint from today's eyes of what it means for us.